of the of New York University and the Universidad Diego Portales in Chile. As you know, last Sunday, Sebastián Piñera, wealthy businessman, won the presidential elections. He represented the center-right Alianza por Chile and won 51.6% of the vote against the 48.3% won by Eduardo Frei of the Concertación. This is the fifth election that Chile has held since the transition to democracy in 1990. The Concertación won the first four. This is truly, I think, evidence of the maturity of the political system in Chile to allow this form of alternation. Patricio Navia is also a correspondent for La Tercera, a leading news daily in Santiago, and he has written there that that a generation of center-left leaders were asked to retire by the Chilean public. The public wanted to maintain the same course, but essentially wanted to change who was in the driver's seat. At the same time, Chile's formerly arch-conservative publication El Mercurio, another daily paper, said that for the Piñera government there was no priority more important than addressing extreme poverty and the inequality of opportunities in Chile. And so I think what we're seeing is a true convergence over certain aspects of Chilean politics. Patricio Navia, as I mentioned, is at New York University, where he holds the title of Master Teacher of Global Cultures in the Liberal Studies program, and he also is a professor in the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. He is the founding director at the Universidad Diego Portales of the Public Opinion Graduate Program, and I also understand has founded and led a center devoted to the study of Chinese involvement in Chile. You left that part. Well, it's a distinguished part of your past. He's written widely on issues of democratization, elections, and democratic institutions in Latin America. And he holds a PhD in politics from NYU and an MA from the University of Chicago, BA from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Patricio, it's a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to be a little bit provoking here in suggesting that Piñera is either the first right-wing president since Pinochet or the first democratically elected president in Chile in 52 years, or he's just the fifth Concertación president. And I'll try to explain why I make that claim. So he did win the election on January 16th, yet he will take office with the lowest percentage vote since the restoration of democracy and the lowest absolute number of votes since the restoration of democracy. Fewer people voted this time around than in 2005 and 99. And he got a lower percentage of the votes. So if you want to associate mandates with the percentage or number of votes, his is a rather weak mandate. The Concertación has perhaps too optimistically claimed that Piñera didn't win. In fact, he got fewer votes than traditional right-wing candidates got in the past in Chile, but the Concertación lost many more votes. So it's really the Concertación's fault. So the Concertación is so used to winning that now they also want to take credit for Piñera's victory. Yet Piñera is still the first right-wing candidate to have won a majority of the vote in Chile since universal suffrage. The last time a right-wing candidate won, Chile had a plurality system, not an absolute majority system. So in that sense, this is really something new. On the other hand, Piñera is perhaps one of the most moderate right-wing candidates that we have seen in Chile in recent years. Just to give you an idea, on his TV ads, he prominently featured a gay couple holding hands, calling on people to vote for Sebastián Piñera. This is not your sort of right-wing, extremely conservative Catholics that are winning, or at least not on the surface. So I'm going to go over 5 basic points. The first on the decline of the Concertación and on the decline of the number of voters in Chile. Then on what the Concertación did and how popular the outgoing president, Michelle Bachelet, is. The third issue, what I consider to be the most symbolic component of this election, is the mechanism the Concertación used to select its presidential candidate and what that cost. Then how good Piñera is of a candidate and his strengths, and then on what comes next in Chile. So this is the percentage vote the Concertación and the right-wing Alianza have received since 1989 in all presidential and municipal elections held in the country. And you can see that percentage-wise the Concertación had a decline. It's sort of a strongest decline in 2009, but that's in the presidential election. In the parliamentary election held in December as well, the Concertación got about 44% of the vote. So that's where the Concertación is. The presidential candidate got much fewer votes than the Concertación did in the legislative elections. And we can also see how the right-wing coalition had difficulties in the years after or immediately after the end of the dictatorship, and how it started to improve ever since. In 1999, they came very close to winning the presidential election. Then the right went into somewhat of a crisis, but it held steady around 40%. And in the first round vote in December, the right-wing candidate got 44%, which is what the right has been getting in the past few elections. But in the runoff, it was 51%, and that was a big change in Chilean history. And this is the absolute number of votes received by the two coalitions, not percentage, but absolute number of votes. And you can see that the right has improved somewhat, and the Concertación has lost many votes. If early in the democratic period, the Concertación got about 4 million votes, in the last presidential election, it got slightly more than 2 million and little bit less than 3 million in the legislative election. The number of voters in Chile has not changed that much over time, and I'll go into that in a minute. So the size of the electorate has remained constant in the past 20 years. So the Concertación has lost percentage-wise, but perhaps more importantly for Concertación, leaders, they have actually lost people. They look, as you know, politicians don't look at percentages, they look at numbers. They say, well, this is how many votes I need to win the election, and they have been constantly losing votes in the country. And this is what I wanted to show you. The first column is the most important one. This is the voting age population. That's Chileans aged 18 or older. The number has gone from 8 million to 12 million in the 20 years since the plebiscite. But the number of registered voters has only marginally increased. This is the second column. It's gone from 7.5 million or 7.4 million to 8.3 million. So there are many Chileans who are not registering to vote. The number of voters, in fact, has remained steady, and valid votes has also remained somewhat steady, around 6.9, 7 million voters. But if you add up null, blank, abstentions, and non-registered voters, that number has kept on increasing. In fact, on the last column, I have valid votes as a percentage of the voting age population, and in this past presidential election, only 57% of people voted. 57% of those eligible to vote actually cast ballots. So there is an ongoing problem, there. So did the Concertación win, or did the Alianza? Did the Concertación lose, or did the Alianza win? Well, they are both losing voters in the sense that the number of voters has not increased and has not kept pace with the number of Chileans who are eligible to vote. This is because there is compulsory voting in the Constitution, which is not enforced. No one gets fined for not voting. So the idea of compulsory voting, it's more a concept than a reality. But registration is optional, which means that people can choose whether they register to vote, in which case they remain registered for the rest of their lives, or they never enter the system. And a majority of Chileans who turned 18 after the plebiscite have chosen not to enter the system. So altogether, there is 4 million people who are not registered and about 8 million who are registered. And most of those who are not registered are 40 years or younger, since they turned 18 after the plebiscite. And this is also skewed towards the wealthy. People with higher levels of education are registered. Younger people with higher levels of education are registered. People with lower levels of education are not. So if the system continues to be in the same pace or in the same path, in 20 years from now, we're going to have an electorate with university level education, and all those who haven't attained college degrees will not be registered to vote. This is an ongoing problem for Chile, and it's a warning sign for Chile's democracy. So, point number 2, the Concertación was a very successful coalition. You can see poverty levels went down from 40% in 1990 when they took office to about 13% in 2006. The actual numbers for 2009 will come out in the next few weeks, but it should be around 14 or 15% because of the recent crisis and the increase in unemployment. But it's still very impressive numbers. Extreme poverty has gone down as well dramatically, and even the Gini coefficient has improved somewhat. Chile is less unequal now than it was at the beginning of the democratic period. But inequality is still fairly high. The Concertación did very well in reducing poverty, in generating economic growth, but the difference between the wealthy and the poor has remained rather large. I often sort of claim in my newspaper columns that the Concertación tends to campaign with the left and then govern with the right. It's sort of a market-friendly, socially oriented economic policies, but it's mostly market-friendly. In fact, President Elwin, the first Concertación president, called it neoliberalism with a human face, or social market economic policies. If you just take and read the economic policies and in Chile without knowing that it's Chile, you would sort of define, or if you were to code Chile, not knowing that that's Chile, you would probably code it as a moderate right-wing government, and that's the kind of policies Chile has, in fact, implemented. So the 4 presidential terms under the Concertación were the first one, the Patricio Elwin 4-year term. There was a lot of economic growth, but also high inflation. In fact, high inflation was somewhat inherited by the outgoing Pinochet dictatorship. Then Eduardo Frei Ruiz-Tagle's first term, economic growth slowed a bit, but inflation was brought under control. And Lagos Escobar was probably the most right-wing of the Concertación presidents, ironically, as a socialist. He really kept, or under his government, inflation was really kept under control. Unemployment increased a bit, and average growth went down. And under Michelle Bachelet, her first 3 years, average inflation increased a little bit because of 2007 and 2008. High inflation levels, employment was low, and average growth was slightly higher than under Lagos Escobar. With the last year, 2009, Chile is going to have or had a negative 1.5% growth. So on average, the Bachelet administration is going to be the administration that grew the least in the 20 years, and the one that created least employment as well. This is presidential approval ratings in Chile, and you can see the yellow line is approval, and you can see that the Concertación presidents have done fairly well in terms of approval ratings, with the exception perhaps of the 96-99 period, where President Eduardo Frei had more disapproval numbers, the higher disapproval numbers than approval numbers. And then President Lagos did fairly well, particularly towards the end of his term in late 2005, early 2006. And then the big surprise was Michelle Bachelet, who went through sort of a U-shape approval with negative approvals or higher disapproval ratings in 2007 and early 2008 when she was hit by the Transantiago transportation scandal, and then her approval really increased, and it's about 75-80% now. This is, in fact, the approval ratings for the Bachelet administration. This is monthly data, and it shows that her approval really started to increase in late 2008. There is a lot of speculation as to why her approval ratings did not transfer on to the Concertación presidential candidate. I have a take, but there is a couple of objective facts as well. The first objective fact is that she didn't choose the Concertación candidate, so the Concertación candidate was selected in a process that she did not participate on, and in fact, it was a man who had strongly criticized her during the Transantiago scandal, so she wasn't very close to him. That's one issue. There is a second issue which I think is very important, and that is after Transantiago, Bachelet pretty much left politics to the Concertación parties, and she concentrated on the social safety reforms, on the pension reform, the sort of safety net reform that she introduced. In essence, she became the Minister of Social Security. She didn't get involved on political issues at all. The best example is perhaps the Mapuche revolt in the south. She a couple of times made calls on the parties to sit down and negotiate, which is kind of ironic given that she's one of the parties. But because she distanced herself from politics, she sort of benefited from the positive effects of the pension reforms, which is in fact one of her most important legacies. But then it was difficult for her to go back into politics and call on people to vote for Frey and campaign for Frey. There are some other issues as well that I'll come back to. Third issue is the Concertación really blew it. I mean, they should have won this election. Since its origin in 1988, the Concertación was associated with the idea of expanding and deepening democracy. It was, after all, the Concertación of parties for democracy. But the transition, as some of you probably know, is always characterized by top-down mechanisms. You have to get the elites to talk, and they sort of negotiate the transition. So it was very much a top-down process with the Concertación parties negotiating or acquiescing to the reforms, last-minute reforms put in place by the outgoing Pinochet dictatorship. But over time, those top-down mechanisms were slowly replaced by more participatory, transparent, bottom-up, representative democracy mechanisms. And the best symbol of this was the way the Concertación selected its presidential candidate. In 1993, some limited closed primaries were held. Then in 1999, open primaries were held to select the candidate. President Lagos won an open primary. In 2005, open primaries were scheduled to be held in July, but Bachelet, the nominee of the Socialist Party who was running against Soledad Alvear, the candidate of the Christian Democratic Party, Bachelet was so popular that Alvear decided to drop out before the primaries were held. And in 2009, the Concertación apparently was going to have primaries, then it wasn't, and we'll see now what actually happened. So the entire primary issue, the way the candidate was nominated, I think symbolized how the Concertación got it wrong this time. There was no formal mechanism to nominate the presidential candidate. There was tradition, there was precedent, but not a mechanism within the Concertación coalition. To some extent, this was because President Lagos, who had left office with very high approval ratings, had expressed, or at least not formally declared, that he would not be a candidate. So when politicians say, I want to spend time with my family, as if other people don't, they are really saying, I might want to run again. So I want to leave that option open. And that's what Lagos did, and potentially that's what José Miguel Insulza and the Secretary General of the OAS also did. They left the door open, and the Concertación parties didn't know whether they would jump into the race or didn't, so they didn't want to establish a process to select its candidate for 2009. And Lagos, in fact, waited for several years, which in fact also prevented, he sort of created a bottleneck in his own coalition that prevented other people from seeking the presidency because they were all waiting for Lagos to decide whether he would be or wouldn't be a candidate. So as Lagos waited and he sort of started putting in some conditions, the Concertación parties established a mechanism to select the candidate. They got together and they said, okay, we're going to have primaries somewhere in the middle of 2009, and since we don't know whether parties will or will not nominate candidates, we're going to leave it open for 6 legislators from the Concertación to put forward the name of a candidate. That's the condition that candidates must meet to be nominated for this primary. And then President Lagos did, and then perhaps one of his not happiest political decisions, and put some conditions under which he would be the Concertación candidate. One of those conditions was that he would not run in a primary. He said, well, I have already been elected by Chilean people, so as a former president, I'm not going to submit myself to a new primary. Arguable concept, since he was elected to be president for 6 years, not elected to be an eternal candidate. And then he sent another letter, and these are public letters. They were published in the press in October and November of 2008, saying that he would be the candidate if he had the power to affect the nomination process of legislators or Concertación legislative candidates. So he said, I want to nominate the people that I will work with in Congress. The Concertación said thanks, but not thanks, and so Lagos decided to drop out, rather surprisingly. And then, as Lagos dropped out, also surprisingly, José Miguel Insulza, the OAS Secretary General, decided to drop out of the race as well, and so did Soledad Alvear, one of the contenders of the Christian Democratic Party. But former President Eduardo Frei, who people didn't really believe was a very good candidate, stayed in, and he said, "I'll run. I'm going to follow the rules, and I'll run." And in January of 2009, Marco Enrique Sominami, a young socialist deputy, 35 years old at the time, a member of a notorious Concertación family and the biological son of a guerrilla leader who died or who was killed in 1974 during the dictatorship. The Enrique Sominami Gumucio family has been in Congress for about 90% of the last 100 years. He said, well, I'll run too. And I have the 6 deputies, so I'll be a candidate. But as Insulza, Alvear, and Lagos dropped out, the Concertación party said, well, why are we going to have primaries? We should have Eduardo Frei as the candidate. So they changed the rules under which the primaries would be held. And the new rules were, well, each party will nominate a presidential candidate for this if primaries are going to be held. And the Socialist Party, the party of Enrique Sominami, nominated Eduardo Frei. The Christian Democratic Party nominated Eduardo Frei. And the PPD party also nominated Eduardo Frei. The Radical Party said, well, we'll have a candidate as well. So they forced a primary. And these primaries, really fake primaries, were held in April of 2009. And that was the symbol of the Concertación big mistake. The primaries were only held in 2 of the nation's 15 regions, with the additional condition that if one candidate won by more than 30% of the vote, there would be no more primaries. That candidate would become the Concertación candidate. There was a presidential debate, but it was only broadcast to those 2 regions. A number of websites offered to broadcast the debate to the rest of the country, but the parties didn't want to have primaries, and they said, well, no thanks, we just want to formalize the Frei nomination. And that day, I think the Concertación sort of made it clear, and now even Concertación leaders acknowledge that the mechanism through which the candidate was selected was not a good mechanism. And that triggered Marco Enrique Sominami's independent run. In fact, he resigned from the Socialist Party later, and his support started to increase mostly as a protest vote against the Concertación. Enrique Ominami was much more a messenger than a leader. He received support mostly from people who were discontent with what the Concertación was doing. So the transition was characterized by top-down politics and no transparency. That's kind of normal in transition to democracy settings. But democratic consolidation requires more bottom-up mechanisms of democracy, more participation, more transparency. And the Concertación did very well the first part, but it sort of ran into problems with the second part. Bachelet's election, in fact, symbolized that change. She was eventually nominated because people wanted her, not because the political party elites wanted her. And in fact, she promised citizens democracy, horizontal democracy, so she wanted more participation, and she represented that idea of more participation. And once you sort of make that transition, there is no going back, and apparently the Concertación wanted to go back. Bachelet also promised in her campaign, one of her most famous promises was that there would be no second servings. So, nadie se repite el plato, as she put it. So she represented the notion of new phases of renewal. The Concertación had historically offered a combination of change and continuity, and Bachelet was that perfect combination as well. Frei and Lagos had also been a combination of change and continuity. Continuity in the policies implemented by the Concertación and change in the phases. Lagos was the first socialist since Allende, and Bachelet was the first woman to be elected president. But in terms of policy, there was much more continuity than change in what they did. And what it turned out to be the case in 2009 was that Frei was much more continuity than change. In fact, he was just continuity, a former president, and no change. He tried to bring in some change, but his campaign just didn't know how to do it, and eventually it's difficult to be the candidate of change when you are a president who was already president 16 years ago. So in essence, it was a step backwards. And Marco Enriquez Ominami stole the concept of change from the Concertación. He perhaps went too far and had an offer no continuity. I mean, he was a sort of lone ranger in a very, very strong political party system democracy. So if Frei made a mistake in offering too much continuity, Enriquez Ominami offered way too much change. A combination of both of them would have been the perfect Concertación candidate. So, but the Concertación probably did this because the general perception is that Chile is mostly a center-left country, that the majority of Chileans don't like the right. After all, the right had not won an election in 52 years. And thus the perception was that Chileans weren't really going to vote for the right at the end of the day. This graph shows identification with political sectors. What I want you to pay attention to is the green shadow in the back. That's the percentage of people who identify with none of the three political sectors. And that has kept on going up since the early 1990s. So in essence, Chile, in fact, is not a country where the right is a majority, but it is a country where growingly people don't feel identified with the three traditional political sectors. And that was what the Concertación, I think, did not read well. People are less sort of held hostage by political ideology in the traditional sense that we understood Chile. In addition, Chileans do not really identify with the center, and this is an interesting point here. This is just a graph that shows identification with the right, center, left, and then number 4 is none of the three alternatives. And the majority of Chileans do not identify with any of the others, but more people identify with the right and with the left than with the center. So center is a politically charged word that people don't really like. When you ask people, are you centrist? They say, no, I'm not centrist. But then when you ask people, well, then place yourself on a 1 to 10 scale and tell me where you are. And the majority of Chileans place themselves in between 4 and 6. So they are moderate. They don't like to say they are center because being centrist means being Christian Democrat. So say, well, I'm not a Christian Democrat, I'm an independent, or I'm a right-wing, but moderate, or I'm leftist, but I'm also moderate. Chile is a very moderate country. If you see this, if you compare this graph with the previous one, you're going to get very different results. If you only see the previous one, you're going to say, well, the center is weak. But if you see this graph, you're going to say, well, it's not really weak. I mean, people just don't want to call it center, but they are very, very moderate. So that's where the electorate in Chile really is, and that's the kind of electorate that people should try to, or candidates should try to cater in or campaign for in elections. So it is a moderate electorate, but it's increasingly dissatisfied. There is discontent with political parties. I have a colleague at Universidad Diego Portales, Mauricio Morales, who claims that Chilean political parties are hydroponic. They are very strong on the surface, but they don't really have strong roots in society. I think it's a very good point. So there is discontent with the party systems and with the party system and with political coalitions in Chile, but Chileans are moderate, so there is a tension there. They are moderate, they don't like the political party system. They want change, but they don't really want too much change. They want change in style more than policies. They don't want to change the roadmap. Maybe they want to change the person in the driver's seat or the pilot, given that Piñera owns land. But they want to keep the same roadmap. To some extent, I mean, if you want a religious image of this, Chileans have, after the Pinochet dictatorship, well, they crossed the desert and now they are in front of the promised land. They don't want to go back to the desert. There isn't really right now a threat of a populist reversal or an authoritarian reversal in Chile. They don't want to hear those prophets. They do want to go over to the promised land. The middle class in Chile has grown to be about 30, 35, even 40% of the population, depending on how you define it. But those who are on the other side of the river see that it is possible. They have very high expectations. They want to cross. They want to push forward. They want to speed up the process rather than change course. So in that sense, they want a balance between change and continuity. And this is what I think Piñera and a good part of the Alianza have read accurately. The Alianza did rather badly after the end of the Pinochet dictatorship. In 1989, they only got 30% of the vote. In 93, they only got 30% of the vote. In 99, they came close to winning, but they still lost. And in 2005, they got 47% of the vote in the runoff. And in 2009, the Alianza finally got it right. In essence, what they did was campaign on the same policies that Concertación had implemented, and they offered change. And the change was not in terms of policies, it was just in terms of who the candidate would be. So Juan Miguel Sebastián Piñera Echenique, he likes to say that his father was a public sector worker, but his father was an ambassador to Belgium and the Corfo representative in New York City. So there are public sector workers and public sector workers, right? But he went to one of the wealthiest, most elitist schools in Chile, but so did Freire for that matter. So in that sense, there isn't that much of a difference. And all of the presidents that we have had in Chile, except Bachelet perhaps, have gone to very elitist schools. And he did get a PhD at Harvard at age 26, and then worked for a couple of years in CEPAL in Santiago. His family comes from the Christian Democratic Party. His father was a very, very good friend of Eduardo Frei. In fact, during the campaign and the presidential debate, when asked what presidents he admired most, Sebastián Piñera named two Concertación, two Christian Democratic presidents, Patricio and Eduardo Frei, the father, the 1960s president. So he sort of was a copycat of the Concertación coalition. He stole the Concertación's message and offered new faces, offered efficiency based on his sort of business-like or business experience. He understands public policy issues rather well. He has experience, he has communication abilities, he perhaps has excessive communication abilities. If you ever hear his speeches, he always says the same idea 3 times, 3 words that mean exactly the same, but just 3. He never goes over 3. So I'm very happy, satisfied, pleased to be here with you today. Okay, so, but he has some weaknesses as well. He is a successful businessman in a country with high levels of inequality and at a time of high unemployment. And his really big problem is the conflict of interests that I will come back to later. But he hasn't really built a firewall between his business side and his political side. He's made a fortune after the transition to democracy and during the years that he was sitting in the Senate. So here in the U.S., he would have been impeached or expelled from the Senate many times. And he has some excessive personalism, which is not good for the party system, but it helped him in this election because he could distance himself from the traditional right and with the Pinochet-associated right. He's really a centrist in a right-wing coalition. And this is the polls that were conducted in Chile in 2009, and they showed Piñera ahead throughout the campaign. The red is Eduardo Frei, and green is Marco Enríquez Ominami. So polls did a fairly good job in predicting Piñera's victory, but the margin was closer than some of the polls had predicted. And these are the polls throughout 2009 on sort of what would happen on a runoff election. And they all anticipated a very close runoff election, but none of the polls conducted in 2009 gave Frei a victory in the runoff. So the sort of last-minute perception that Frei could win was mostly wishful thinking. There was no poll in the entire year that had given Frei an advantage. And just a few minutes on where the Piñera votes came from. This is a poll in late October of 2009. We don't have exit polls in Chile, so this is the most recent poll closest to the election that I could use. And Piñera won among the upper class overwhelmingly, but he also defeated Frei among the middle class, and that was very important. Frei did fairly well in the first round and second round among the poor, but if you want to see this in terms of sort of class struggle, it just happened to be the case that the middle class was much bigger, and it gave the victory to the candidate of the bourgeoisie. So the Concertación, in that sense, was a victim of its own success. In terms of gender, Frei could not get the same support from women as Bachelet had received, and Bachelet, in fact, was sort of an exception. Traditionally, women in Chile have voted more for conservative candidates and also for Christian Democrats. But after Bachelet got more women votes than men votes, that wasn't the case for Frei. In terms of age, this is very interesting, and this also helps explain Piñera's victory. Frei did much better among the elderly than among the young. In fact, the youth overwhelmingly voted for Marco Enríquez Ominami. Marco Enríquez Ominami did not make it to the runoff because most of the youth, as I told you before, are not registered to vote. But in all polls, Marco Enríquez Ominami was ahead of Frei, but among registered voters, Frei was always ahead of Marco Enríquez Ominami. But in the runoff, a good chunk of those younger votes went for Frei, and not rather for Piñera, and not for Frei. So the Marco Enríquez Ominami vote among the youth was almost evenly split for Frei and Piñera. People wanted change. The Concertación did not offer with Frei enough change. So in terms of presidential approval, and this is perhaps one of the most surprising things that happened this year, Piñera did get a good percentage of those who approved President Bachelet's performance. So Chileans separated Bachelet from the next presidential elections. In essence, Chileans were very satisfied with the Concertación. When asked whether they thought the Concertación had done good things for Chile, they all said, yes, it has. But then they decided that the Concertación wasn't good enough for the next phase of Chilean development. This is like when you need to buy a new house. You're very happy with the old house you have, but you need something different. Nothing against your existing house, but now you want to move on to something different. And that's what the Concertación did not understand well. I'm just going to skip over some of these numbers, but this show how Piñera was leading in the polls throughout the period, and how Frei was in fact going down towards the first round, and Marco Enrique Sominami was going up, but certainly not fast enough to defeat Frei in the first round. This is Frei's strongholds were in rural areas. This is rather interesting because traditionally the Concertación had done much better in urban areas with urban poverty, but as urban poverty started to decrease and people moved from the poor from being poor to being part of the low middle class, they started abandoning the Concertación. In that sense, the Concertación was a victim of its own success. People did not necessarily perceive Sebastián Piñera as sincere, as an honest person, but they did think he was efficient. This is the question on which candidate was the most sincere, the most among the three, and Enrique Sominami won. But sincerity is not sufficient to win the presidency. But when asked which of the candidates could do a better job in dealing with specific issues, Piñera always came up ahead. So people did not really believe what Piñera told them. Those three synonyms just didn't do it for people, but they did think Piñera was more efficient than the other candidate. And when asked what is the most important thing a president needs, people said, well, he has to know how to do the job. So if he's friendly, if he's nice, it's less important than having him do his job rather well. And this is an interesting poll as well. When asked whether they were certain as to whether they would vote or not vote for a candidate before the first round, 54% of people said that they were certain that they would not vote for Frei. And this was true throughout 2008 and 2009. So the Concertación went against the polls in selecting Eduardo Frei. It was at least based on polls. Frei had very high negatives to a large extent because he had already been president. The Concertación chose to ignore that, and that was the result. Chile is to some extent a very polarized country. As you can see, 47% of people said that they would never vote for Piñera. So Piñera didn't really have a large margin to win, and but he still had better numbers or lower negatives than Eduardo Frei. So Piñera, I would argue, was a superb candidate. He offered the right combination of change, new faces, and continuity. He talked a lot about change, but in essence, his change was not in policies, but rather on some different emphasis. He talked about being more urgency. We're not going to sleep, or while people sleep, we're going to be working to deliver, and I have no time to lose. So the idea that the Concertación had sort of gotten used to power and it had slowed down the reforms, which was seen in sort of the reduction in economic growth, and Piñera promised that would change. He also focused the campaign on crime, and in that sense, he has created very high expectations. He campaigned on criminals, sort of your time off is gone. Now we're going to go after you. So if crime rates remain high, there's going to be some negative reaction towards Piñera. And crime rates, as you can imagine, will remain high by Chilean standards, not by Latin American standards. By Latin American standards, Chile has very low crime rates. So Piñera celebrated the Concertación successes. So when the Concertación said, we have done all these good things for Chile, Piñera said, the Concertación has done all these good things for Chile. But they don't really have an answer for the future. And that's where the Concertación didn't really have an answer for Piñera. He was almost a Concertación candidate. especially in the runoff where he regained the notion of change that Marco Enriquez had taken away from him in the first round. So in the runoff, Piñera was sort of the Concertación balance between continuity and change, whereas Frey was just continuity. So, final point, what comes next? Well, after 20 very successful years, Chilean people want change, but not too much change. They don't want to change the roadmap, and that became clear in the polls and the way people voted. So Piñera needs to reassure people that change will be neither drastic nor traumatic. He has to make sure that this is not going to be dramatic change. Moderation is, in fact, the key word. The Chileans like moderation, and they have voted for moderation in the past. So he has to promise change in the...
They drink tea, not coffee.
They drink tea, yeah.
Not coffee.
So they want change in the context of continuity, continuity in policies, but change in the faces, in the people who lead these policies, and in some emphases. Crime, corruption, efficiency, urgency, those things are very important to people. In some of the focus groups I participated in, people would say that they like the idea that Piñera is promising to do things that the Concertación claims cannot be done. So issues like crime, Piñera is saying, well, I will solve that issue. And the Concertación has said, well, we are doing things to solve that issue, but these are long-term problems that cannot be solved immediately. So the Concertación might be more honest, perhaps, but less enthusiastic about what can be done. So what are the threats that the Piñera government faces? I would say that there are 4 threats that we have to, that we should look to that might become Piñera's nightmares. The first one is the Pinochet shadow. The idea of having foremost notorious leaders of the dictatorship in high office is something that, of course, will haunt Piñera. He has responded that he wants to appoint younger people, and in that sense he's saying, I'm not going to appoint the leaders of the Pinochet dictatorship because they're old. But the whole Pinochet problem will certainly haunt him, at least until he makes his cabinet appointment. There is a second point, and that's the elitism. Conservative parties in Chile do not have leaders who represent the diversity of the country. The Concertación has become much more elitist in recent years, but it still has more roots in society. The right doesn't really have those roots, and I mean, if you want a symbol of this is when Piñera appoints his cabinet, you're going to feel like you're going into a wine store. All the names are associated with like wine companies. But that's going to be a problem, although that is increasingly a Concertación problem as well. I'm going to give you an example of this. When confronted with the problem of bad quality public education in Chile, Michelle Bachelet would often say, well, I want to improve public education because I'm the proud daughter of private or public education. She went to a public school, but she sent her kids to private school. So she's the daughter of public education, but she's a mother of private education. But the right has much more of this problem than the Concertación. Then the third issue, which is, I think, the most important issue that Piñera will face, are business conflicts of interest issue. As The Economist put it, Piñera must govern in Chile's interest, not his own. And this is, I think, going to be a major issue in his government. And I'll come back to this in a minute. And the fourth issue, I think, is the conservative moral crusade. People fear that in Piñera's government there will be sort of far-right UDI activists who will want to reverse many of the individual freedoms and that Chile has achieved in the past 20 years. I find that as a non-credible threat. because it's difficult to take freedom away from people in democratic settings. I mean, some of that certainly happens, and we have seen that happening in the past, but under special circumstances. And moreover, Piñera is much more moderate than the UDI. He's in essence a Christian Democrat. He's not, and a very liberal Christian Democrat for that matter. He's not right-wing conservative nut, as some people have characterized him to be. So I don't see that as a major threat, but it is a threat to be considered. Piñera.
No Freud in the room.
Yeah. So that I always call all Chilean presidents Pinochet. So I did that with Lagos several times. So Piñera has a number of opportunities ahead. He can, in fact, do the same thing the Concertación did in 1990. Take the good from the previous government and leave out the bad. And that's what the Concertación did in terms of market-friendly, socially conscious, or market-friendly policies. The Concertación added sort of a socially conscious platform and left out the authoritarianism and human rights violations. So if the Concertación always campaigned with the left and governed with the right, Piñera can govern with the same policies the Concertación has implemented. He's going to have minority support in Congress, just as the Concertación did throughout most of the 20 years. So he's going to be forced to negotiate, to bargain with the opposition for his legislative initiatives, but he doesn't really need to pass a lot of legislative reforms, because the system in Chile is already in place for a market-friendly sort of neoliberal kind of government, which is what the Concertación has in fact done for the most part. Piñera can tackle some issues the Concertación could not afford to deal with, state modernization, for example, including the modernization of Codelco, the copper giant, to a large extent because he doesn't really own favors to labor unions. So he can bring about some modernization that the Concertación could never bring about precisely because of labor union issues. And in terms of Codelco, he can start out not privatizing Codelco, that's not going to happen, but he can certainly start out by eliminating the 10% tax on Codelco sales that go directly to the armed forces. And a left-wing government would not be able to do that, but a right-wing government can certainly do it. It has the legitimacy to do it. In terms of privatizing Codelco, I do want to make one point, and that is that copper is already privatized in Chile to a large extent. In 1990, 90% of copper produced in Chile was produced by Codelco. Today, Codelco only produces 30% of the copper produced in Chile. So Codelco was not privatized, but copper in Chile was privatized under the Concertación. So even if Piñera were to privatize the 30% remaining copper production in Chile, that's Codelco's, the big privatization of copper in Chile happened during the Concertación years. So something else Piñera can do is improve public education. He can really take on some of the lack of regulations for private education and strengthen that way public education by making it more competitive. We'll see whether he's committed to doing that. He says that it doesn't really matter what schools kids go to as long as they are good schools. So he will probably introduce more accountability to both public and private schools. But he has to show that he's more pro-market rather than pro-business. And that's a big challenge for a right-wing government, and particularly a right-wing president who has a lot of business interests. He's not going to push for privatizations. There isn't really that much to be privatized in Chile. So again, there was more privatization under the Concertación than what Piñera can expect to do or hope to do in a 4-year term. Neither can he champion moral issues. The electorate is not going to stand for that, and approval ratings are an important component of democracy. And he has to be careful as to whether he adopts policies in favor of big businesses. He has to adopt pro-market, pro-competition reform rather than reforms in favor of big businesses. To a large extent, the last two Concertación governments, the Lagos and Bachelet governments, adopted reforms that favored both competition, but also benefited some of the large businesses. So a lot of sectors were highly concentrated and are highly concentrated in Chile. Piñera could, in fact, take on some of those sectors. So what about the Concertación? Well, I think everything will depend on what Piñera does. If Piñera is successful as a moderate, the Concertación will drift towards the left. Hardliners will take over and populism will be the norm. If Piñera takes away the Concertación sort of moderate platform, the Concertación will have no space but to move to the left. So, and I think moderate Concertación leaders will eventually join the Piñera government, or at least cooperate with the Piñera government, if Piñera is a moderate president. If Piñera is not successful, meaning if Piñera moves to the right, the moderate Concertación has a good chance to return to power in 2013, because most Chileans are moderate. So the question is whether Piñera understands that most Chileans are, in fact, moderate. So will he be successful? I think he will. He has a roadmap to be successful. But I would say that what we should worry about is not Pinochet's shadows, is really the shadow of Berlusconi. It's not Pinochet what we have to think about, but rather Berlusconi. Piñera is himself moderate, fairly liberal as a person. His stance had been rather liberal. He understands the need for social inclusion. He's very horizontal in the way he treats people, yet he has had problems with conflicts of interest in the past and with creating a firewall between business and politics in the past. And he made a fortune when he was a senator. He continued to do business and politics throughout the 20 years of the Concertación. The Concertación is partly to blame for this. They never really pushed for legislation that would create conflict of interest or conflict of interest legislation. They always thought that they could use that against a right-wing candidate, but then people no longer believed that was an issue, or they believed that is an issue, but still chose to vote for that candidate. So if I were to anticipate the problems Piñera will face, they are going to be mostly problems associated not with Human Rights Watch, but problems associated with Business Week and Wall Street Journal. That's where we are going to see the big criticism against Piñera, and probably justified criticism. I think Piñera is going to be the fifth president of the Concertación Republic. Not necessarily a Concertación president, but he's going to keep pretty much what the Concertación has done. The Chilean institutional system fosters moderation, long-term horizons, and incentives for negotiations between stable coalitions, and that's what we have seen in the past 20 years and what we should continue to see. Change is difficult because it requires consensus. And these conditions that facilitated the transition in 1990 will facilitate the transition towards a new right-wing government. And I think this is the last slide. Yeah. And just one final point. I mean, if you want to understand Piñera, think of him as a recovering alcoholic. He has promised in the past not to drink again, but he's failed. Now he's in a different position, but it's a much more difficult position. He will have the temptation to drink again, and my take is that he will. But again, it's not Pinochet, it's Berlusconi. Thank you.
Very good. But has he apologized to those he hurt? We'll see. Okay. I'd like to invite questions and comments. Please identify yourself for the benefit of other people in the room. I'll take Jose Miguel Vivanco. We just closed with an invocation of the name of Human Rights Watch, so we'll ask Jose Miguel, the Executive Director, and then Cole Blazer, formerly of the Library of Congress.
Patricio.
Please wait for the microphone.
Okay, Jose Miguel Vivanco, Human Rights Watch. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I agree with many of the points, or perhaps most of the points that you have made. I have only one question. I agree with you with the description of Chilean society as a moderate society, but also you mentioned that it's a rather polarized society in political terms. And during these 20 years, my sense is that the organized working class, unions, essentially, they have the sense that the government that was in charge in Chile was to some extent their governments as well. So there were, we never witnessed, a very, very serious crisis of in terms of governability during those years. There were many problems, but at the end, the Concertación was able to get a deal with those unions. My question is, how do you see that working in Chile under the Piñera administration, given the degree of polarization in the country, and the fact that for the first time you have in charge a government that represent neoliberal, policies, as well as the Concertación, but they are right-wing or center-right, whatever you want to characterize. But they are essentially the classic. You have the classic conflict and interlocutors, of la CUT. I'm thinking about the, unions of that degree of ideological component, and a right-wing government. You see any potential issues there, and conflicts and tensions in terms of governability in the country?
Let's take a couple questions, put them on the table. Cole, and then this gentleman here. Gary, we'll take three first, and we'll come back to Gary. Cole, wait for the microphone.
Don Patricio, in spite of your amusing critiques, Chile, since Pinochet, has a brilliant democratic record in comparison with almost all other Latin American countries. That's why so many of us love Chile.
My name is Hector Luisi. Thank you very much for your presentation, which I thought was quite stupendous. I learnt a lot. Two questions. One of them is simple curiosity. You mentioned several times in your presentation the word corruption, to the extent that, according to Transparency International, which is the only measure of corruption in Latin America comparable, that Uruguay and Chile are the only two countries that appear with, to quote Lula, os louros de olhos azuis. What do you refer to as corruption in that context, given Transparency International? And pegging off the question of this other gentleman, which I found terribly interesting, regarding possible problems with unions, could you comment, to the extent that Mr. Piñera is a very successful businessman, particularly in labor-intensive businesses like an airline, what has been his experience as a businessman dealing with labor over the years which have guaranteed his success? Instinctively, I would think that given his success in labor-intensive businesses, he is able to deal with labor. But I would appreciate your comment pegging off this gentleman's questions. Thank you very much.
Patricio, we'll give you a chance.
Okay. I think in general there are two points here. If Piñera shows himself to be moderate, he shouldn't have big issues with public opinion. He will have issues with labor unions, but most labor unions in Chile are public sector labor unions, and they go on strike all the time. And for the most part, our public opinion is not that interested in what happens to public sector unions. But to some extent, Piñera has to do exactly what the Concertación did in 1990, and that is to guarantee some key sectors that change is going to be gradual and pragmatic and not very dramatic. The Concertación had to make that guarantee to the business sector in 1990, and it did so successfully. Piñera has to do it with the labor sector, and it's a challenge that remains to be seen. Of course, there will be components or leaders in the labor sector and within the Concertación that will want to sort of burn the country right away with a Piñera presidency, just as there were some in 1990 that wanted to make the Concertación government fail. But the Concertación successfully sort of neutralized those sectors by offering centrist policies. And that's what Piñera needs to do. He can, if he sends labor flexibility legislation to Congress in the first 6 months, then he's going to have problems. But he's a bit smarter than that. That's not something he's going to do. He's going to send pro-employment legislation first, and then if the unemployment levels go down, then he might look into a sort of flexi-security, the word mostly used in Chile to sort of talk more about more flexible labor laws. But those flexible labor laws are something that even some Concertación leaders champion. So he can get support from some Concertación leaders, and that's going to lead to some polarization. But Piñera knows, and polls and other surveys show this, that Chileans are much more divided about the past than about the future. So he has to say future much more than he says past, because the past actually does divide Chile rather strongly on issues like human rights and what to do with the pending cases. For example, he's going to have some issues there. There's a good argument in favor of eventually bringing those cases to closure. It's been, after all, 36 years since many of those crimes were committed. There should be closure at one point. But that's a sensible argument, but it's a sensible argument to be made by a leftist leader, by somebody who represents the victims of human rights, not by somebody who represents those who committed human rights violations. So sensible arguments are less sensible when made by people who might be perceived as benefiting from those sensible arguments. So if the Concertación didn't make those arguments, Piñera shouldn't. Same with flexi-security. The Concertación could bring that about, but it's going to generate problems if the right brings those about, because people are going to perceive that those are pro-business reforms rather than pro-market reforms. And then the issue of democracy in Chile and corruption. Let me just give you a metaphor here. Chile is... Imagine Latin America as an emergency room, and there are people with heart attacks, people who have heart attacks and then a car accident, and some people who are drinking and using drugs and then had a heart attack and then a car accident, and they're all in this emergency room. And those are the countries of Latin America. And Chile comes into this emergency room with some chest pain. Gets there on his own, and drives there, and tells the doctor, I have some chest pain, really bad chest pain. I think I may have a heart attack. So they do all the tests, and then they come back and tell Chile, look, your cholesterol is high, your blood level is high, you are overweight, you are under too much stress, you've been drinking a lot, you're sleeping, you're not sleeping enough. So you have to change your behavior. You're okay, but you need to change a few things, otherwise you're going to have a real heart attack in the future. And that's the problem Chile faces in Latin America. It's not an urgent problem. Chile will do well in the next 3 or 4 years. But there are some issues there. I pointed to one of them, the number of people who are not voting, that keeps on increasing. Those are issues that are mounting, that will generate problems in the future. This is not an immediate threat. And the problem for somebody, I don't know if you've had that, but the problem for somebody who has chest pain and goes to the emergency room and comes out knowing that it wasn't a heart attack is that the incentives to change behavior are not really there. In fact, you might just go out and sort of drink a bit more and eat some more because you are very happy that you didn't have that heart attack. And that's the kind of challenge Chile faces, and it's not an impossible challenge, but it does take the concept of urgency away from addressing those problems.
Okay. Gary, and then we'll take Jose Raul and this gentleman in the back.
Thanks. Thanks for a great presentation. Two quick questions. I found it very interesting that the polls showed that nobody, Gary Bland at RTI International, by the way, that nobody really, or that Frey was in the past years was polling under Piñera. Was there anybody showing that they could do a better job in the or could win other than Frey? Was there anybody else out there that could have defeated the right? And second, quickly, could you talk a little bit about the future of the Concertación? That is, you were in your presentation, at least. It sounded as if you expected them to continue and not potentially dissolve or break into its component parts. Thanks.
Jose Raul Perales, Wilson Center. Patricio, I have two quick questions. One is, if I read you correctly, it seems that for Piñera to be successful, he almost has to replicate Michelle Bachelet's formula of being an administrator and distancing himself from the more radical elements of his party. And I wonder if you could comment something about precisely that, the relationship between Piñera and his party, especially considering that that Piñera will also be facing an opposition Congress. And so this is also another way of affecting his gestión. And the second thing is, Piñera didn't run on a foreign policy ticket, but I wonder if you could make a couple of comments about what might be coming out of this newly elected president in terms of foreign policy, in terms of the things that he's been saying so far.
Okay. And one more over here.
Patricio, thank you very much for your insightful presentation.
Please let us know who you are. Yeah. I'm sorry?
Evan Willett with the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. Mm-hmm. I don't think that anyone would foresee a reversal in the social progress that's been made under the Concertación, but I wondered if you could comment on the possibility of the extension of new freedoms in the social arena, specifically the availability of the morning after pill, gay and lesbian rights, certain things that did come up briefly within the campaign. And secondly, if you could possibly comment on the political future of Marco Enriquez Ominami. Obviously, that will depend upon Piñera's success, but if you could quickly comment on his future independently of Piñera's success. Thank you again.
Okay, so the best position candidate in early or late 2008 was Ricardo Lagos. Now, he would have the same problem of change and continuity, but he was certainly a better candidate than Eduardo Frei. It's not clear what would have happened with José Miguel Insulza, whether he could have represented that change. But that's why primaries are so good, because they test candidates. They allow for people to know whether candidates are really up to the task, and people can see their strengths, and even parties can see their strengths and weaknesses. So in that sense, primaries would have been a very good option. Without primaries in early 2008, we could have anticipated, or late 2007, that Hillary Clinton would have won in the U.S. But primaries allowed for candidates to compete. So in that sense, we'll never know whether there was someone better. My own take is that to a large extent, this is President Lagos's responsibility. He should have made it very clear early on whether he would run or whether he would not run, so that other people within the left could have thrown their hats in, including some notable Chileans who are now living in exile here in Washington, D.C., like Nicolás Eizaguirre at the IMF, and some other people who wanted to run but just couldn't do it because they were waiting for Lagos to decide whether he would throw his hat in or not. As for the future of the Concertación, the electoral system is what keeps the Concertación together. So they might fight a lot, and for that matter, the Alianza, they might fight a lot, but that at the time of elections, they have to come together because it's very difficult to make it into Congress if you are not a part of a coalition. In fact, the Concertación now brought the Communist Party in, and the Communist Party will have 3 deputies in Congress starting in March out of 120, but it's still more than they ever had since the transition to democracy. So as long as the electoral system is in place, the Concertación will be hard-pressed to stay together, or at least most of the Concertación will stay together. On the relationship between Piñera and his own party, this is a difficult issue. Piñera belongs to the Renovación Nacional, sort of a moderate right-wing party that it's really, it's like the Democratic Party. It has local bosses that are not very happy with the UDI, and that's what brings them to Renovación Nacional. So there isn't sort of ideological cohesion within Renovación Nacional. But Piñera was the candidate because he was very wealthy, not because the party elected him. So in essence, some people say that Piñera entered politics to be wealthy. I think it's the other way around. He sort of developed a very strong business side so that he could enter politics without having to submit himself to the traditional right-wing parties. So he's very much his own man. I mean, he despises his own political party, and his worst political enemies are in UDI, not in the Concertación. I once asked him, and this is this off the record, or...?
Make this
okay,
comment.
I'll make this comment off the record. I once asked him if he had a last bullet, who would he use it against? And he just looked at me and he said, well, I would have to choose between Pablo and Joaquin. That's Pablo Longueira, the leader of UDI, and Joaquin Lavín, the leader of the former presidential candidate. But he will have to deal with them. UDI has 40 out of 120 members of the Chamber of Deputies, so he will need UDI. Now, he has said in private and even hinted at in public that it would be very difficult for UDI and Renovación Nacional to vote against him in the first year. So he might send a legislation that UDI is not very happy with. They will tweak with it, change it a bit, but they can't vote against their first democratically elected president in 52 years in the first few months. So, but he's going to be very careful as to what legislation he sends. I mean, he's not going to send gay marriage legislation to Congress. The Concertación wouldn't do it. You can't expect that to happen from a right-wing administration. But in that sense, he's free, and we'll see that in the cabinet appointment in the next couple of weeks. He said that he's going to appoint the cabinet in the middle of February, and he's going to have several independents. He's making efforts now to recruit some Concertación leaders, and he's asked at least 3 sitting Concertación cabinet members to stay on. One of them has publicly said, no, I'm not going to stay on, so he's out of the race. 2 others have been rather ambivalent. René Cortázar, the Minister of Transportation, and Patricio Poblete, the Minister of Housing, both of them Christian Democrats, have been rather ambiguous. They have talked again about wanting to spend time with their families. So it might be the case that he successfully sort of brings more moderate people into the coalition, and because the UDI campaigned for 20 years against political party quotas, they can't really say anything. The UDI now wants quotas, but it's very difficult for them to make that argument publicly. And in fact, all the columnists are having a field day telling Piñera, if you bring quotas, you know how you're going to suffer, right? You're just like another Concertación president. So because they were out of power for 20 years, they promised so many things, they made so many commitments that they are going to be bound by a number of different interests that will come and hunt them. Piñera was signing about 5 commitments per day during the last month of the campaign. So that's about 150 specific commitments that he signed publicly. Of course, no one cares about that on television except the people that were there when the commitment was signed, and they will bring that huge piece of paper Piñera signed and protest before the La Moneda Palace. So in that sense, he's going to have to meet a number of expectations, and he's going to force the political parties to follow him, even if parties are very unhappy with what he does. On foreign policy issues, I think this is going to be a major issue for Piñera. In fact, President Hugo Chavez already started picking on Piñera yesterday, saying a few things here and there. Piñera will not have many friends in Latin America, and the friends, or the people that want to be his friends, are not very good for him. I mean, he doesn't want to be friends with Álvaro Uribe, who's looking for friends, because Álvaro Uribe has all the things that the right in Chile wants to run away from: the military, human rights violations, excessive force, a close relationship with the United States. I mean, that's not the friend you want. This is a recovering alcoholic, cannot go out with somebody who drinks a lot. So another friend Piñera could have is the president of Mexico, but then no one wants to be friends with the president of Mexico these days. The perfect friend for Piñera would be the president of Peru, Alan Garcia, but Peru has border issues with Chile, and it's going to be very difficult for them to come together. Piñera will go out and seek Lula out. He's going to fly to Brazil, and he's going to offer Lula his friendship for everything Brazil wants, and Lula is going to say, well, good, you'll be my friend, but you know what? You have to solve the issue with Bolivia first. No one would ask Michelle Bachelet to solve the issue with Bolivia, because Michelle Bachelet was such a nice woman. But this right-wing man, you're not going to give your friendship to him that easily. You're going to ask a few favors from him first. So I think Piñera will soon realize that he has to keep a low profile in terms of foreign affairs. He could be smart and then appoint sort of human rights advocates as his Minister of Foreign Affairs, sort of what Sarkozy did in France. And in that sense, you could sort of take on issues with Venezuela and Cuba with somebody with unquestionable human rights credentials. But I don't think he's going to go that route. He's just going to keep a low profile. In terms of new freedoms, no, I don't think this is likely to come from the government, from top down, but it will continue to happen bottom up. I don't see reversals in terms of policies, but the government is not going to champion more freedoms. But that's pretty much the norm in Chile, except under Bachelet in a couple of issues, and just a couple of issues. For the most part, freedoms in Chile have been bottom-up, and the government has reacted to them. Think of the divorce law that passed only in the Lagos administration. So the government, the Concertación government, was never a champion of individual freedoms, or for that matter, human rights issues. Human rights progress is mostly due to work done outside Chile and by NGOs in Chile, and say Baltasar Garzón did more for human rights in Chile than Concertación presidents did. So when the Concertación now says, well, look for human rights stuff and they don't really have a good track record in terms of individual freedom and human rights freedom. And Piñera is not going to reverse that. Piñera has said publicly that in 1980, with the fake plebiscite that Pinochet had to approve the 1980 Constitution, there is a picture of Piñera and his father, a notorious Christian Democrat, in a rally against the 1980 Constitution, and Piñera has jokingly said, look, Eduardo Frei Montalva, the father, was there. I was there. Where was Eduardo Frei that day? And clearly Eduardo Frei wasn't that committed to those issues at the time. So in that sense, Piñera personally is not that big of a problem. His coalition might, but then again, he doesn't really owe that many things to his coalition. And there will be obviously a power struggle there, which I think Piñera will win. And then on Marco Enrique Sominamis's political future, I think he was much more the messenger than a leader. He's now trying to create his own political party. There isn't really space for a new political party in Chile, given the electoral system. So he either joins one of the existing Concertación parties, he can take over one of the parties rather easily, at least the Radical Party he can take over rather easily, and then sort of initiate an opposition from that party. But if he sort of tries to build a new party, I don't think it's going to work. There's going to be three forces competing for the representation of the left in Chile. The Communist Party, which will move the Socialist Party farther to the left. Then there will be the moderate Concertación, led by Ricardo Lagos, the son, not the father. The father has pretty much abdicated in favor of his son. He says, I'm going to retire from politics, but he's sort of given the indication that the one condition he's putting to retire from politics is that he chooses his successor. And it might well be Ricardo Lagos or Carolina Toa, another young politician. The problem, though, is that they still don't understand that people have to choose the new leaders, not the outgoing leaders. The PRI system, the Mexican PRI system, doesn't work anymore. So the first is the Communist Party that will pull the Socialist Party to the left. Then you're going to have the moderates. And then I think there is going to be some room for some populist reaction that might in fact gain strength if Piñera's sort of business shenanigans include part of the Concertación. If people perceive that the Concertación and Piñera are sort of together into deepening the system and sort of going from pro-market to pro-business, then you can have sort of a populist reaction, which might be the route Marco Enrique Sominami might choose to take in the future. It would be unfortunate for him, for I don't think it's going to be very successful, but in the last few weeks, ever since the runoff, he's sort of hinted that that's the kind of ideological space that he likes to be in.
Okay, I think we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank Patricio for his presence and his excellent presentation.